It's tomorrow will be Labor Day, and given the weekend, I'd like to give the congregation some career advice. Afraid of heights? Don't take a job as a high-rise steel worker. Speak only one language? Interpreter is a bad career choice. Afraid of water? Stay out of the Navy. Alcohol problem? Don't buy a bar. If you spent your life in an office as a lawyer, mentally manipulating complex concepts, you have 2 soft hands and 2 left thumbs. Don't go into construction. It's not a good idea. Now, the first 3 of those, I just figured them out myself. The 4th I had to learn in the School of Hard Knocks. In our last years at Denver, we decided to purchase an 1890s house, completely remodel it, and sell it, of course, for a huge profit. Many of you may have seen the 1986 movie with Tom Hanks, The Money Pit. That actually is a tamped down idea of my experiences. One of the first things that happened on the house, right after closing, I pulled by the house, opened the second store window, tweaked a little bit of loose plaster, and sure enough, all the plaster on that side of the house fell off. $12,000 down, and we were less than an hour after closing. Move over, Tom Hanks. It was a long summer working on that house while worrying if we would have to literally delay our retirement because of it. Pam called it Little Jimmy's construction camp, packed me off every day for another hot day of dirt, dust, arguments with subcontractors, and of course, ever-increasing bills. One bright spot was my developing friendship with a jack-of-all-trades guy named Tony Fleeter. He was a friend of another worker on the job, and he showed up one day looking for work. He had the type of looks that immediately caught your attention. He was 50 years old, 5'10", a rail-thin but sinewy 125 pounds. He had a scraggly beard and only a couple of teeth left, both rotten. He smoked so much that he smelled of nicotine, even during those rare times when he wasn't smoking. He was one of those alcoholics who drank all the time, smelled like it, but I never really saw him drunk. He more than occasionally used drugs, mostly marijuana and others when he could afford it. But he also was the hardest working, most capable construction worker I have ever come across. He was tireless and he was strong as an ox. He was a licensed master carpenter. He could perform miracles with wood, drywall, and tile. He also had a yeoman's skill in electrical, plumbing, tape and texture, and painting. Largely because of his work, we finished that house just as the market was falling apart in 2008. Fortunately, we sold it in a few days and only lost a few $1,000s, which, given the circumstances, we considered an act of God, or maybe Buddha, or maybe the God of Tony. After all, we were yuyus. We had a lot of other work for Tony, including remodeling our condo in the mountains for sale, getting our home in Denver ready for sale, and getting our house in Corpus Christi prepared for our move-in. Over the next 2 years, he largely worked for us. I learned a lot about Tony because I worked with him almost every day. His mom married and divorced 5 times. When he was 13, she married her 3rd husband, a vicious man who hated Tony and used to physically abuse him. Tony ran away from home and lived as a feral child in the streets of Denver for 2 years. He learned a lot of useful skills, like, for example, at 3 o'clock, McDonald's throws out all of the uneaten lunch burgers, and you can feed yourself by dumpster diving. At age 15, his mom divorced that husband, remarried a kinder man, and Tony returned home to finish high school. He then fell in with a bad crowd and begin a career as a cat burglar. If anyone could climb through a cracked second-story window, it was Tony. But that career didn't work out when someone woke up, hit him in the head with a fireplace poker, and the police were able to follow Tony's blood-stained trail in the snow. After a plea bargain, Tony spent 4 years in the Colorado penitentiary, a result probably most of us wouldn't have a problem with on either side. When Tony got out of prison, he got a job working at Denver University's cafeteria. The job came with school benefits, and he actually finished 3 years of college when he was caught around a marijuana transaction in which he was the buyer, but given the amount involved, appeared to be the seller. With a prior conviction, his inexperienced and overworking public defender, which they all are, said the best he could get him was 12 years in jail. That was too much for Tony, and he took off to Louisiana. 2 years later, he returned to Colorado, worked construction for 6 years, and was finally apprehended when his picture showed up on a security camera at a casino near Denver. And that he had had a clean record for 8 years, and this time could afford a good lawyer, he was put on probation, I think pretty much for the rest of his life. But by law in Colorado, he couldn't drive a cab, work for the government, handle money for a public company, on and on. Not only was Tony unemployable, he was also persona non grata. He couldn't borrow money at a bank. He couldn't apply for a student loan. He couldn't rent most apartments. Basically, he couldn't survive except by doing anything that he already was doing, working kind of low-end construction work. By the time I knew Tony, he was in his 50s. He was physically worn down. He'd been hauling heavy concrete bags, holding up drywall, moving beams, twisting wrenches, and standing in weird position while exposed to the Denver climate of both extreme heat and extreme cold. He had a number of repetitive motion injuries, a deformed thumb, scars on his arms and legs, a nagging hip injury, a bad back, and fallen arches. He wanted to do something else for a living, but there was literally nothing for him to do. Tony's type of problems, in a way, is of relatively recent origins. When I began practicing law in 1977, most criminal records were largely unavailable to the public. By and large, people with a criminal record just failed to disclose it and went on with their business. Now, for $25, with a good private detective, you can pretty much trace a person's life back to their birth. The U.S. has the highest rate of incarceration in the world, at least 4 times higher than the next country on the list. Adding the roughly 2.25 million people in jail to the almost 5 million adults on probation or parole, like Tony, nearly 3% of the population are under some type of correctional supervision. By contrast, there are 340,000 Unitarian Universalists in the world. Or there's 21 U.S. prisoners for every worldwide Unitarian. There are many issues concerning our prison policy, which many of you are familiar of. One is the growth of it. The other is the war on drugs of the 80s. Next, the growth of privately run prisons is spawning a prison industrial complex. Next is the racial bias of our legal system, and there's many more. Some of these issues have finally grown legs. There's presently bipartisan, for those of you that can't remember more than 8 years ago, that means both political parties are interested in something, to at least curtail some of the excesses of our prison policies. Marijuana has been legalized in 2 states and decriminalized in a host of others. The Justice Department, the U.S. Justice Department, plans to end its use of private contractors in all federal prisons. They're just going to phase them out over the next few years. Of the perhaps 500,000 prisoners who may be released in any given year, 67.5 will be rearrested within 5 years. The amount of money spent on prisoners and prisoner programs while they're in prison does not tend to change this statistic one iota, suggesting that what happens to an individual once released from prison is way more important than what happens to him while incarcerated. Telling someone recently released from a controlled environment like prison that they can't have a job can't find a place to live is obviously not a recipe for success. Tony considered himself a success story, and he was. He was able to find a way to make a living, get a comfortable place to live, something 2 out of 3 individuals that went to prison don't even come close to. Now, in every Disney movie I've ever watched with my daughter, the plot is almost the same. Good guy tends to fall off the wagon of good, go bad, eventually have some type of epiphany, overcome his weakness, and proceed to do not good, but great for the rest of his life. In The Lion King, Simba leaves the kingdom, languishes in the jungle, has his epiphany, returns to the kingdom to defeat Scar and rule justly forever. As does John Alden become a nature-respecting white man in Pocahontas. Johnny Tsunami learns to snowboard and eventually gets an apology from the bullies. And Katie and the Mean Girls learns the lessons of true friendship and is forever a true friend. Unfortunately, this trend doesn't stop at age 11. Every singer-entertainer goes from rags to riches, and the love of a wonderful woman to betrayal of that woman and drugs, back to the bottom and rags, to epiphany, back to that familiar forever greatness in all respects. Some of you have seen some of these movies about Ray Charles, Johnny Cash, The Supremes, and Dreamgirls, Little Richard. How about athletes? Rocky, Christian Bale and The Fighter, Olympic hockey team in Miracle, Robert Redford in The Natural. How about reformed drug dealers and American Gangsters, Down and Out Lawyers in The Verdict, research chemists, The Insider, doctors, Patch Adams, military recruits, An Officer and a Gentleman. It's perhaps even worse on the adult side, I think, because these are often played as fact, not fiction. The point isn't that Hollywood has no imagination, but more importantly, this is both of a reflection of and an influence on how we all think about life. And it's largely false. Most of us don't get clear victories over our problems. The victories are less spectacular and more subtle. We tend not to get by our problems, but to gain a little ground on them as life goes by. You lose 20 pounds on a diet, but you immediately gain 10 of them back. Your socially challenged child doesn't become president of the student council, but maybe he makes a friend. Real progress in life tends to be incremental, but is nevertheless worth applauding. Backsliding on that progress is to be expected and dealt with, not to be condemned as abject failure. And so it was with Tony and most prisoners. Some of Tony's behavior was downright saint-like. When he wasn't working, without pay, he pulled weeds and did odd jobs for elderly widows he knew in some of the poorest parts of Denver. He bought a small but comfortable and well-kept house in an old neighborhood in Denver, of course, completely under his girlfriend's name, who, coincidentally enough, was a legal secretary. And while he made every payment on that house himself, he was incredibly rarely allowed in it, probably because he smelled, like I discussed before. Hey, Tony never complained about this. He made the house's one-stall garage in the back into a comfortable living space where he slept with his 3 dogs. It looked a little like a trailer type thing. But believe me, Tony was no saint. There was that constant drug and alcohol use. There was his ability to screw things up when given enough rope. The reenactment during the first reading today really showed the best and the worst of Tony. Let's face it, Tony stole over $5,000 from me. But in situations like that, you rarely see that guy again. Tony did hang in there, faced the music, and he did pay me back every penny of that bill. Now, in the movies, Tony and I would have combined our strengths, formed a construction company, and rebuilt the World Trade Center. But like in a lot of real-life relationships, our weaknesses overshadowed our strengths. I would have made a better sociology professor than a construction foreman. I'm a lousy supervisor of people. Tony worked efficiently when directed, but he tended to slack off when you left him alone. It finally came to the point where I had enough of his lapses and vowed not to use him again. But we'd had such a good and warm relationship for so long, I just didn't want to end it bitterly. So I paid him for work, which he really hadn't completed, and told him basically all our work happened to be done. I've kept track of Tony. He still does a lot of work for friends of mine. And I've warned those friends, supervise Tony, and definitely do not give him a credit card. Tony got his 2 rotten teeth pulled, and he's in line for a full set of dentures through a dental school. He has, at least temporarily, quit using drugs, as, in his words, quote, he doesn't want to live the rest of his life in a drugged-out haze. So, Tony keeps proceeding in life with some small but incremental victories. That's how my life has gone too, and probably most of yours. Hopefully, we all can appreciate our little victories and forgive ourselves for not being exceptional.